Welcome back everybody, and the next dynamics object we're going to take a look at is the flip domain. Now the flip domain is a way of simulating liquids or fluids in general, which can be less dense. So a liquid is an example of a dense fluid or a reasonably dense fluid, and then a low density fluid is something that's sort of gaseous, like smoke or just, air is a gas, so you could simulate air, of course. But the main thing that the flip domain does really well is the liquid simulation stuff. And that's what we're going to take a look at mostly, because I feel like in XParticles4, something called exposure effects has been added, and it's mostly usurped everything that the flip domain dealt with in terms of gaseous simulations. So let's take a look at our scene, just work out what's going on here. And if I press play, we can see it's a pretty basic scene. We've got an emitter, we have a gravity modifier, and we have some colliders. We also have a floor that's black just to kind of clip the view a little bit. Not necessary really, I can turn that off even. And we'll see that going. So what happens when I add the flip domain? Now the flip domain is a contained space where the fluid simulation will occur. I'm going to drop a fluid domain in, and you can see these particles are all outside this domain at the moment. If I go back to the beginning and press play, we'll see what happens. And immediately, in fact, I'm going to turn the colliders off as well, actually. Let's turn the colliders off so we can just see it clean. We're seeing the particles are hitting the bottom of this domain, and they're flowing around in a sort of liquid fluid fashion. And you can see them swirling, and we get this nice liquid motion. Very, very organic, very realistic in terms of liquids. Excellent. So what's actually going on here? Well, we've got a domain object. We've seen these before. We've seen it in the flow field recently. And with this, we actually have a voxel, and each cell, or voxel or cell, depending on how you want to describe it, each cell calculates velocity of the particle and a bunch of other stuff as well. But the basic idea, the end result is a velocity is applied to the particle. A velocity is just where a speed is applied to the particle and also a direction. So that's what velocity is. And it's very similar to our flow field, if you've seen that part already. But if I go to my display tab in the actual flip domain object here, I can actually check velocity on. And if I actually increase the alpha a bit so we can see it nice and clear, we can actually see these velocity vectors. Now if I press play, as it plays, you can see them all being calculated. And the cool thing about this is that it's not looking at the particles for their velocity, it's actually calculating the velocity, then applying it to the particles, much like our flow field can do. But in this case, instead of using sort of abstract or arbitrary inputs like the normals or the spline object tangents, that kind of thing, to give us our direction and speed, we actually derive those from sort of physical calculations. So basically fluid mechanics, which is it's a pretty high level subject. There are these equations called the Navier-Stokes equations, and they've actually been around for a very, very long time. And they allow you to kind of calculate the momentum of a fluid, the energy conservation, that kind of thing. And what you get out of this, obviously, is the important part for us, really, is that you get this really nice looking liquid simulation. And it's actually very fast as well. So, like, if you imagine, this is, you can get to thousands of particles, and actually it remains pretty quick. So if I actually increase our particles to 20,000, we don't actually see a significant speed hit. Apart from the displaying, obviously, that's always going to take a hit. I'm going to change the display to, say, squares. And there we go. It's still pretty quick. And obviously, resolution in a voxel domain is very important. So if you want more detail in your simulation, you decrease the voxel size and increase the voxel number. So if we go to our domain, we actually can see on our object tab here, we have of voxel controls here, so we can actually use the viewport as well, so we can control this. And if I press play, it obviously will be in a much sort of smaller area. And of course, we can control these physical properties of our liquid to an extent. Of course, we can't go too far with that. But what it does is it allows you to create all different kinds of fluids with different viscosities and that kind of thing. Now, I'm going to go back to the line display because I like that one when we're doing this sort of stuff. And let's drop the particle count back down to 2000. There we go. And So what can we do? What can we do with this fluid? What can we do to the flip domain to kind of change the look of our fluid? Well, of course, we could introduce colliders, that kind of thing. So if I add in these colliders, you'll see our fluid actually makes contact with them and it actually pushes around them. If I hide them, you can actually see the space that's being left behind. You see there, it's kind of going through this torus. And you can see actually up top down is a really nice way of seeing the fluid flow. Excellent. So what else have we got here? We've got this type drop down here, and it allows us to go to gaseous or particle gas. Now, I said previously, we're going to pretty much skip over these completely. And the reason is that I think they've been completely usurped by the new fluid, exposure effects. So I wouldn't worry too much. You can definitely play with these if you like. The rendering can be quite slow though, I find, and also the simulation can be very slow. Whereas the exposure effects container deals with gaseous fluids very fast. So I would recommend that. So we just leave that in liquid for our purposes here. And then we can take a look at these settings here. So what's weak spring? Well, FLIP, which actually stands for fluid implicit particles, if anyone's interested. Not that we need to know that. But it suffers from an issue where the fluid sometimes collapses. If it doesn't have enough solver steps, if there's not enough particles in there, the fluid can actually collapse into nothing, which in reality is impossible. You know, a fluid can't compress beyond a certain point. Most of them are incompressible as well. So what you do is you have a weak spring, and as we had with our constraints, all this does is it pushes the particles apart. It just keeps them at a certain repulsion level, and it just means that the fluid won't collapse. The volume is maintained. So worth keeping that on, to be honest, and the default strength is that. And you can find a balance for that. If you're finding your fluid is collapsing into like losing its volume, increase this strength. But it does dampen the simulation a bit, so you might want to watch out for that. What's the next one is vorticity. Now, vorticity is pretty much how much the fluid is going to swirl around. And can you see how all the liquids are moving? If I turn off our colliders again, we can see here. And let's go top down again. And you can see our particle sort of swirls around and we end up with these interesting looking swirls. Well, we can actually increase that using vorticity. And you can actually go to a really high value. And you see immediately our fluid is more energetic, I would say. And it's just encouraging it to swirl around itself. Probably a bit too much there at 1,000. But like vorticing in a fluid is almost like you're getting a spoon and just churning it all up and making it sort of churn up much faster. That looks really cool. Okay, and then we've obviously got viscosity. Viscosity is the thickness and how much it'll stick together. So if you have a viscosity, immediately you can see something cool happening. We end up creating a fluid that's much more sticky and it doesn't spread out. It doesn't fill the container as quickly. And we end up with this nice looking simulation. And we can have a few different sort of viscosities in there and mix them and match them. But that's the sort of basic properties that you have to control the motion of the fluid. And then, of course, we have all of our modifiers that we have in X particles that we can combine with this. And so if I drop we've obviously got gravity in there already. What if I drag perhaps an attractor? Let's put an attractor in here. Let's pause a second. Let's put our attractor over here somewhere. And I'm going to have it increase its force a little bit. Press play. And you can see that attracts the fluid over to the corner over here. But it still maintains this fluid motion. So all the fluid is still being calculated by the flip domain. So we can kind of create these unrealistic in the real world, but they still obey some laws of physics. So you actually get some really beautiful simulations and you can control them this way using modifiers. Excellent. So these are just particles. Essentially, the emitter is still coming out, and these are particles, just as they've always been in X particles. It's just that they're being given them velocity by this domain, and they mix with the other modifiers and dynamics objects just as well. So you could use the constraints to add viscosity, surface tension, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's go to have a look at some more sort of technical stuff about this object. So we've looked at how to kind of give it a bit more motion and flowing. Now, if you increase the voxel count, you're going to get more detail in the simulation, but the simulation time will increase. So obviously, the more detail you add to the simulation, the more time it's going to take to simulate. And you can see it gives you sort of a readout of how many voxels you've got here and how much memory that's using. So it's pretty low at the moment. I wouldn't call this a stressful simulation at all yet. But I will warn you, all fluid simulation stuff, if you start to crank the settings, if you start to go to very realistic levels, you're gonna have to deal with simulation times. And that's not a problem as long as you build that into your production workflows. Getting some really nice mixing of the speeds there. Did you see how it bounces off the walls here and comes back in? Talking of the walls, actually, the reason it's colliding with this object. In fact, let's talk about the adaptive domain actually, because currently, can you see this white box that's moving around here? If I drop this down, the simulation will actually be a lot faster. And the reason for that is that the white box is actually the simulation area or the simulation volume. It's called an adaptive bounds. And what's happening is it's looking for where the particles are and where it needs to simulate velocity. Because if it just simulates the whole container, it's going to be a lot slower. So what it does is as the fluid comes down, did you see it adapts down and shrinks down until eventually it'll get quite close to the particles. And you can control this by going to the display, not display, sorry, it's in the solver. And if you look at the solver, we have this here called adaptive. So if I turn this off, we'll lose our adaptive display, our adaptive bounds, and you'll see the whole thing becomes the solving area. And it's still not too bad in terms of speed. However, it's not very efficient. So when I enable it again, you can see it adapts down to this side again. And if I put our emitter to one side, for instance, you'll see it the bounds will only adapt to that side to begin with. See? And as it spreads out, it crosses over to the other side. And that's just an efficiency thing. It saves memory, it saves performance. And I would recommend always having this on. If you're finding that you have a really, really fast fluid and it's moving around the container really, really fast, or the domain really fast, you can reduce the threshold down, or you can increase the threshold even. And you can also change the amount of voxels that it will expand by. So it becomes more sensitive to the motion of the particles. If you drop it down, it only goes to where it needs to go. And if you, like I said, if you have fast fluids, it'll adapt to those. But if you leave it on the default 0.1 and 3, you're going to be good most of the time. Okay, so we're on the Solver tab. Might as well talk about that as well. We have a bunch of stuff. We have a retiming slider, just like in the emitter. And you can see there, we can just reduce the speed down. This actually increases the accuracy of the overall simulation as well, because it has more time to solve the velocities. And you actually get sort of subframe stuff. So you could actually you could cache this at 30% or 10%. And then actually retime it to be 3 times faster or whatever, and it'll play back in real time. Okay, and then we have accuracy. Now accuracy, and you should probably always have this checkbox on. I've actually had it off by default. This is how the solver works. So the more accurate you have, the more calculations will be going on, and the more accurate the fluid will be, but at the sacrifice of speed as ever. And if you turn fast off, fast essentially just means that it's doing rough calculations, but they're still accurate to a degree. It just means that it's more visual based than it is based in science, because all of this technology, all of this stuff came from a scientific background when they were trying to solve fluid dynamics in weather systems, and a long time ago, but looking at flows of rivers and things like that. So that's why these settings are here. And if you're finding you need to increase the accuracy of your simulation, say it's missing parts, it's not looking quite like realistic enough, increase the accuracy. I tend to leave it at 10% though. I think the default is pretty good. Now, iterations, this is the same as almost all our dynamic simulations. If you increase the iterations, it's the number of times it iterates the calculation on each frame. Okay? Same thing with accuracy, really. Okay, so what's this one here? This is an interesting one. Pick and flip. So what do they stand for? Well, flip is fluid implicit particle, and pick is particle in cell. Now, particle in cell is older, not by too much, I don't think, but the actual the equations behind it all is very old. But the actual way to solve them inside this domain is from the 80s. But basically, we have these two modes. We have pick and flip. Pick is much better at just sort of general particle velocities, and you won't get much swirling. That's what we really need to know here. So you can see here, it's pretty interesting. But do you see we don't get these vortices. Flip is much, much better at creating these vortices. And the reason we have this slider from 0 to 100%, 0% is all pick, and 100% is all flip. The reason is that flip can get a little bit too overzealous, shall we say, with its vorticing, and it actually becomes somewhat unrealistic, and the conservation of energy is a bit too high, perhaps, in terms of a realism thing. So if you leave it at 95, where the pick comes in, it's a blend between these two solvers, and essentially it just means that you get a more realistic, balanced and muted simulation that doesn't get too out of hand in terms of its vorticing. All right, so there we go. That's the sort of basics of the solving, and obviously we have max substeps here, iterations and those multiplying against each other. So just be cautious with using these. You don't want to go too high, and of course, all of this can also be controlled in the global Command D. If you go to the project settings, you have this subframe step stuff. Press play, and it goes very, very slow, but it's calculating much more subframes, way more subframes. Okay, I'm just going to leave it on 1 because it's nice and fast. Go back to our domain. And then we've already looked at the adaptive thing. So what do we have next? We've looked at the strength, vorticity, and viscosity. Now we have just general sort of technical, useful things that we've seen these in loads of other XParticles objects. Ways to include and exclude things. So if I've got a couple of emitters in my scene and I only want one of them to be seen by our flip domain and the other one I just want to be a normal emitter. Say it's just like imagine it's like a dust. In fact, let's do that. Let's do something that would be a realistic scenario. So say I've got this box here, and this is just going to emit. I'm just going to give it a random color, and I'm just going to use the color from the emitter. Or sorry, the icon color, and I'm also going to exclude the gravity from it. There we go, and there we go. And I press play. So you can see here, I want to exclude this emitter from our system because it's being solved. And you can see actually even though I've excluded gravity, when the other particles come in, there's velocities actually hit our new particles and move them around. Well, and it's also slowing the simulation down hugely because we've now filled the domain. So we actually need to exclude that, so we just drag it into the exclude field. And there we go, much faster. This is the only part that's being simulated, but our other emitter has been excluded. And as ever, the ever handy same system checkbox is in there as well. So if we had an emitter outside of this system, but we didn't exclude it from the domain, and I just click same system, and it would just mean that it wouldn't be solved as well. So that's an awesome one. Now, we've also got groups, modifiers that we can include and exclude, and colliders, of course. Now, colliders in flip domains, you've got to be a bit careful. It doesn't work in the same way as a traditional collider does. It does to some extent, but what happens is in a flip domain, you've got to remember all the velocities are being dictated by that domain. So when it comes to colliding with stuff, if something tries to force it back away from a surface or something, like the collider does, the flip domain doesn't know how to solve that. So it thinks that the motion should be going through the collider object, and you get all sorts of weird stuff going on. So what the flip domain does is it looks at the collider, it turns it into a voxel object, and then it solves those voxels individually. So if I go to the display tab, we can actually see this. And this display tab we'll talk about as well whilst we're here. Click on colliders, and you can see these little red dots appear. And all that's saying is that it knows there is a collider in this voxel. If I go to wireframe, or if I hide our colliders, you can see there, that's the representation. So bear this in mind. If you're finding that your collisions aren't accurate enough, it is because your collider, your voxel size is too big for the collider. So you'd need to reduce it down perhaps. And I can I could probably increase the voxels back up to 20, which is the default, and we'd still have no problems. And you can see it still flows around. But if you add speed to the simulation and stuff like that, you might end up suffering a little bit. Okay, so since we were on that display tab, let's talk about that. And we have a way to view the grid, of course, just like our other voxel objects. And we can look at the whole voxels. So that's each cell is visible. I quite like that view. It kind of gives you an idea of how dense that can be. We can have a look at the base. So basically that means that whatever the bottom of the container is, or the bottom of the domain is, that's where the voxel size will be displayed, previewed. Back is the default. That means it'll automatically, whichever is furthest away from the camera is going to be the one that shows. So that's the default. That's probably the most helpful. Okay, so next up we've got velocity, which we've actually looked at already. And then we have all these other properties. Now, the properties is more relevant to the gaseous stuff, but I will say that you can still use it in this mode. And if I click on speed, you can actually see, and if I put it into auto range, we can actually see in our domain a visualization of the speed of the particles. Obviously, this isn't a velocity because we haven't got a vector showing us the direction, but it does give us an idea of where the fastest particles in the simulation are. It's a nice little display mode. Like I said, the other stuff, it's all suited to the gaseous stuff, which we'll look at in the EFX part. Okay, but we can actually apply physical data to this. We can actually put physical properties into the simulation. So if I go to physical data and I actually increase the temperature, I go to our domain, click temperature, and you can see there our temperatures being displayed as well. This might be useful for something like where you're freezing the particles using a temperature. We could use a physical object to reduce the temperature down in the simulation, and then have the particles solidify, freeze. So that'd be quite good fun. Okay, so this that's sort of the majority of the basics of the flip domain object, and there are a few things to sort of look at as well in terms of resolution and things like that. So like I said, if you've got a detailed simulation, it's going to take longer to simulate. Not a problem. Just make sure to factor that into your work time. And also, you're gonna when you increase the detail, your cache size will be much bigger. Let's take a look at a cache object that we've got, or a cached simulation I have down here. It's much higher res. I also meshed it using OVDB. Oh, I need to hide these objects. Oh, I can actually get rid of those. Don't need those ones in here. This is a cached simulation, so I can actually scrub the timeline. But you can see here, I've got this collider, which, side note, I actually created using the OpenVDB mesher, which is fantastic. I just meshed it and then I actually poly reduced it, so it's pretty efficient collider. Okay, so when I press play, what happens? We get a beautiful looking particle flow. And you can see here that the detail's quite high. I've got the voxel count at 10, or voxel size at 10, sorry. And the particle count is much, much higher than what we had before. And you can see we get this really beautiful, realistic sloshing of the liquid. And that's where flip domains really come into their own. It's like a tank of liquid. And, you know, velocities of the particles are calculated really accurately and physically. Cool, so that's the particles. What if I turn on the OVDB mesh? It's a pretty, I didn't crank the settings too hard on this, but you can see it looks really nice. And you get this, you know, really nice look of the way it flows around objects and stuff. I should really, if I was to redo that one, I would do a higher size of, so in the actual OVDB mesher, I'd do a higher point radius and use larger filters and maybe even a lower voxel size. Because actually, that's a relatively low res mesh. If I made that editable, you can see there how dense it is. It probably needs to be denser than that, to be honest. Okay, so that's just having a look at a higher res version. Nothing special to that one, just a different kind of collider, and the domain itself is set to pretty much defaults. So that's what I like about the flip domain, is you can just jump in with the defaults and it looks great. So I'm going to turn off collisions in that one. And let's go back to our domain actually, and oh, we need to hide that. There we go. Going back here, I just wanted to show you something else pretty cool with the domain and the properties and stuff. I just remembered that it's a little bit of a bonus thing, but I thought it'd be quite cool to show. So I'm going to duplicate my emitter. I'm going to have another emitter over here, and this one I'm actually going to make a cold emitter. So I'm going to go to to extended data, physical data, and I'm going to go to negative 100 in the temperature. And I'm going to go to positive 100 in the, or maybe positive like 20. Maybe I'm going a bit too far with that one. And then I'm going to have each one display by parameter temperature. And let's use like a heat gradient. There we go. It's quite useful for this. There we go. And we'll see something happening here. So I'm gonna let's turn the colliders off. We don't need those on as well. Press play. And what you can see here is that actually our cold fluid comes in. In fact, do you know what? I should fix them so it's not automatic. Let's do minus 20, 20. And you can see here, our cold one over here, actually it looks a bit, probably double. That's fine, that's fine. So as the other fluid comes into contact, it actually starts to heat the other fluid up. And you see, eventually, they all mix with each other, and the temperature is then transferred back to the particles, and you end up getting a slower moving fluid when it's colder. So it's actually really cool. I should turn that attractor off, by the way. That shouldn't be on. So you could actually reduce the speed down using sort of drag or something like that. But it's really interesting that you can sort of mix these properties, and then you could drive that, and you could also pass it to the skin surface, like a Skinner surface, that kind of thing. So you can see perfectly that mixing there. So this shows one of the advantages of a fluid domain. It can calculate very quickly transfer of properties, so velocity, temperature, that kind of stuff. Awesome. So whilst I've got back on our basic domain, I can show something quite interesting here. When you've got one domain, we actually didn't look at this a second ago, is the collisions. So I can actually tell which walls are colliders. So currently, all our walls are colliders. If I actually do just Y minus and X plus, you can see them, they highlight which ones are solid. If I press play now, you'll see, oh, I need to turn our floor off, don't need that on. You'll see that over here, our particles are colliding with the wall. And they're also colliding with the floor, which is X plus and Y minus. And you can see the rest of them escape and they just pour out. So once they've left the domain, they're no longer being given new velocities, and they're just being controlled by other modifiers such as our gravity. So that's really cool, I think. And the other cool thing is you can actually catch it with another domain, which can be very interesting. And this is actually quite a useful technique if your scene is full of quite a lot. Say you had a long simulation where fluid is running down a sort of a network of pipes, and you have a really long thin domain, and then at the end of it, it pours into a tank like a swimming pool or something like that. This is where this would be really handy, is where you'd have a long one, thin one, and then instead of having one domain to encapsulate the whole thing, which would end up being enormous in memory. So I can have this domain under here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it a closed container except for the top, the Y coordinate. So I'm going to press play. I'm going to let the fluids pour out, and then they hit into this other domain as well. And there we go. It's actually showing the collider, the wall as a collider there, interestingly. And that's then caught by this tank below, and you end up getting a sort of a multiple simulation thing going on. So that's quite fun. And you can see there the adaptive bounds as the particles leave the container, the adaptive bounds will go down and down and down. And eventually it might collapse completely, but if there's particles in there, it'll be fine. I could even tilt this now. I could probably tilt this, and you'll lose some of the particles, but you'll also see the rest slide out. All right, so that's the flip domain there. I have one more example that I want to show you guys before we move on to the next dynamics object. And this is just sort of a really cool use for the flip domain object. So you can see it cause sort of physical looking swirls and stuff like that. Let's just see what this object is doing. So I've got a flip art, I call it flip art, and if I press play, we see that we've just got an emitter, and it's emitting from a texture, and that texture is this, from this surface here. So you can see here, it's just a noise texture with some gradient, colorized gradient applied. In fact, it might just be a colorizer. There we go. Colorizer, another name, is ramping. And then those particles are taking on that color. And the reason I want that color in there is I want to see where the flip domain puts them. So I've got a turbulence modifier as well. If I press play now, we'll see they're kept inside the domain, of course. But with the turbulence applied as well, giving them some motion, we then get this beautiful solve where the particles move around each other. And you can see I've kind of got this in a 2D plane. You could do this in 3D, but it wouldn't be as interesting because the image wouldn't be expressed over the whole fluid. And there we go. It starts to mix them up and you end up getting kind of a more diffuse look or an average of the colors. And if we look at our domain, the amount of vorticity I have here, I could increase this aggressively and you'll see the swirls become much smaller. It's actually a really nice way to visualize this. And we get something akin to almost a Van Gogh painting. There we go. And if I turn the weak spring off here, it might help it move a little bit more as well, but it will collapse the fluid if it gets too much. The weak spring off is a little bit quicker to solve, but it's not too much, and you might get these gaps forming a bit more aggressively. So that's pretty cool. And all we could do, if we just wanted to change the texture, of course, we could use another texture. And I've got another one here, which is the GSG logo and another noise texture underneath it. Let's swap that out. It kind of makes this setup quite procedural. And there we go. And we could, of course, reverse this simulation. I feel bad for the gorilla's face right now. Sorry, Nick. But you can see it swirling in and kind of diffusing into the rest of the fluid. That's really awesome. And of course, we could put colliders in this. We could bring a collider in. We could even animate one in from one side. But what would be quite cool is to cache that and then reverse that simulation, and you'd end up having quite a nice reveal on your hands. Very cool. And of course, rendering any way possible. You could use different render engines. You could use the XP. We could just throw an XP object material on there, and it should take the color upon it. I just render. Oh, I've actually probably deactivated the X particles. There we go. And there we can just render that into an animation. Okay, so that's our flip domain object. Hope that's an interesting look at it. There's tons of other stuff. We've got different sort of solvers in X particles for different solutions. The flip domain has always been in there, and I wouldn't describe it as legacy because I think it's still very valid. It's just a different way of solving fluids. So it's within a container and it can be very, very quick. The other ones that are more sort of based around SPH, which is designed for where it's not contained within a container and it's sort of free to flow, and generally it works better with small scale fluids, even though you can scale it up. So yeah, we're going to have a look at one of those next, and I think we're going to have a look at the fluid PBD, which is a really cool one. Okay, catch you in the next one.